So we're back for week 2 of the HBO Limited Series, We Own This City. The story is gaining more background and beginning to build the case, but should you be watching this current episode, or should you wait a few weeks to just binge it a bunch of it? Now I'm going to keep my thoughts on this current episode spoiler-free for the beginning of the video, and then when I dive into spoiler territory, I will give you plenty of opportunity to bail if you want to. As episode 1 concluded, John Bernthal's Jenkins had been arrested by the FBI at the IAD building. Now, of course, he's spouting his innocence, but also his undeniable hubris is breaking through in just every phrase that he blurts. And then when the chief of police goes in to look at him and then leaves without saying a word, the chief then tells one of the prosecutors that all of the others on Jenkins's team that had been arrested, they looked away in shame. But Jenkins was the only one to stare back, with a possibly misguided optimism that he's going to beat the rap. Now this episode continues to work to build out how everything just came to be. Now instead of Gondo giving us the historical background to the federal prosecutors, we now get Ram, who's played by Daryl Britt Gibson. I love his dialogue delivery. He's not quite snarky, but he's direct and to the point, and he has a certain amount of incredulity in his responses, mainly because he's almost in awe that he just has to spell out certain portions for the prosecutors. Now, while the first episode did take me a tiny bit to get used to the way that the story was being put together and then told to us, the second episode felt very fluid, and it didn't take me much effort at all to keep the timeline straight. The only times where things get a tiny bit confusing for me is when there are events that bounce back and forth between 2015 and 2017, but they're not too confusing. I mean, it's just every once in a while where I would have to take a beat to make sure that I'm tracking correctly. The tension in episode 2 is slowly beginning to ramp up, and because we've already seen the gun trace task force arrested, we know some of the outcome, but what we don't know is how it all led up to the arrests. And I think we can all pretty much agree that the Jenkins we see who's been arrested is a pretty terrible individual. He's bending and breaking the rules just all over the place. He's disrespectful, even childish in a lot of his mannerisms and behaviors. But he doesn't start out that way, and this episode shows us a bit of his origins within the BPD and how sometimes it can be nurture over nature that defines a path of behaviors. Now, that's not to absolve him of his crimes and blame them on others. I mean, he is fully responsible for what he does. But I did find it intriguing to see how, because of who he's teamed up with, it helps to determine his outlook and trajectory. And Bernthal is awesome in his role. He's able to show believable outlooks ranging from optimistic and hopeful to mean and corrupt. I'm really enjoying how the case is building from multiple sides and how the story shows all the different angles that the investigators take to secure their case. Now, while there's typically not a ton of action that's shown in this show, at least so far, the urgency and the tension are still present, thanks to some pretty tight storytelling. And there's a portion of this episode where I'm curious at how it's going to tie in, as we have Jamie Hector's Detective Suter working this homicide case. Now, guns are involved, so my guess is that it has something to do with Jenkins's team, but the story also does a great job of showing a lot of the politics that go into upholding the image of the BPD. And that theme was introduced in the first episode and then continues through, with bogus arrests being made in an ultimate effort to reduce the murder rate by keeping people off of the streets by just about any means necessary, even if it's just for one night. And while the sentiment is a good one because lowering the murder rate would be wonderful, the methods by which that goal is attained are illegal or at the very least absolutely reprehensible. Now, the pace of this episode is great, but I'm still wishing that we could have gotten all of the episodes at once just to binge this story and then watch it in its entirety. Now, the 57 minutes of this episode fly by, and like any great story, I mean, it just leaves me wanting more. And not more as in the episode was lacking, but more as in I just can't get enough of the story and I'm impatient and I want it all now. So if you haven't started watching this yet, or maybe you've been on the fence about how compelling the content actually is, this is a wonderfully produced show with a massive ensemble cast, each working their small arc of the narrative to build out one large engaging story. There's no sex or nudity, but there is a ton of profanity and a bunch of violence. And just as a reminder, I'm not going to give a rating for this limited series until the finale, and then I'm going to rate it just as a whole. All right, so now I'm going to dive into a spoiler discussion to address a few key points that I found to be engaging or intriguing within this episode. So if you're going to bail now, thanks so much for couching with me. Okay, so there are a couple of areas within this episode that just ticked me off, but they were totally enthralling. The first is with Jenkins. I mean, this episode really focuses in on the jacked up cycle of dysfunction and corruption. We get to see how Jenkins begins as just this bright-eyed and positive rookie who's then paired with an angry and rule-breaking supervisor. This then creates a cycle with Jenkins becoming the angry and rule-breaking supervisor paired with a bright-eyed and positive rookie. And through several interactions, we get to watch the behaviors and mindsets of Jenkins change. He starts by questioning the methods of arrest, genuinely unsure of the situation and certainly uncomfortable at just the bending of the law by his training officer. And at one point, that TO takes Jenkins to intake, where he gets to see more of the process and gets just the rundown on how people who are arrested can either sign a waiver stating that they won't sue for wrongful arrest, or they can sit in a jail for maybe a day or maybe even longer before they go before a judge and then the case is tossed. I mean, those that are arrested are screwed either way. But in this scene, it's what the TO says to Jenkins about being a cop that is most intriguing, damning, and then aggravating. I mean, he says, "Kid, there is no dictatorship in America more solid than a beat cop on his post." What the crap? I mean, that's showing the messed up mentality of that officer, showing that his judgment, his decisions, choices, and behaviors are absolute and without question. I mean, they're above the law because they are the law. This is also reiterated by Ram, albeit in a different way, when he's being questioned by the feds. He talks matter-of-factly about how he stole from the public in unauthorized and illegal seizures. But what is most damning is how he then describes the lieutenants and sergeants who have to do all of that extra paperwork, but they're exempt from overtime. So they put in even more hours and they don't get extra pay, which then sets up the environment that is opportune for flexible morals. We also learn that Ram got suspended for 2 years after the robbery from the dude he stopped in a car. But that suspension came with pay. And then when he was reinstated, he was put back into a division that was filled with the same corrupt players that he had just been working with. And think about it, for him, there was no punishment. I mean, unless you want to call a 2-year paid vacation a punishment. And if that's the case, I'd love for my job to punish me like that. Now, I had mentioned in my review of episode 1 that I read a WAPO interview with the showrunners and that they had stated that they didn't want to just make another show about police corruption because that had already been done before and it had been done well. They were trying to illustrate through the telling of this story that these situations could happen in any department in the country. And I really like that the story shows that not all the cops in Baltimore were corrupt, that there were a large amount that didn't like what was going on. And then when they'd speak up, they were punished by those that were corrupt. We have that one officer, Willis, who's only like in his 30s. He's been relegated to patrolling some tourist attraction out in the sticks. And now he knows it's this punishment for having spoken up about issues, but his conscience just wouldn't allow him to stay quiet. And we also have the team who's working the drug angle and inadvertently stumble across some of the corrupt cops within Jenkins's team. Now, it provides some great tension, but it also illustrates exactly the point that the showrunners are trying to make, that this can happen in any city at any time. One of the conversations that's captured with Gondo just made me laugh. I mean, just like it did with the cops who were doing the surveillance, because Gondo's attempt to appear innocent was blatant, but it was also comically dumb. I mean, after having almost a full conversation about a tracker and then placing it somewhere else, Gondo's like, "Man, I don't even know who I'm talking to." Okay. And the story also subtly addresses the hierarchy that the city provided to the different groups within the force. Now, we watch Suter and his partner trying to locate their assigned car so that they can go to a murder scene, but Gondo pulls up with his car easily found. The GTTF is seen as a higher producer, so they are held in higher regards. But in fact, I mean, they're some of the biggest crooks in the city. I hope this series shows us how things get changed in light of the GTTF corruption, to show us improvements in tactics and behaviors within the department. But honestly, I'm not confident it's even present for the story to capture. This show intrigues me and it pisses me off simultaneously. A kid who was walking home and was stopped because he looked both ways to make sure he didn't get run over, and then arrested and then assaulted because he was wearing a hoodie and then carrying a pocket knife. And that knife, I mean, come on. It was like one of those little ones that my grandpa used to carry just at all times. I mean, it's like got a, 2-inch blade? As far as I know, there's nothing illegal about carrying one of those. I guess, though, unless you happen to be a black teenager also wearing a hoodie. I'm really curious at how Josh Charles's character Hassel is going to play out. Now, I want Wunmi Mosaku's Steel to nail the dude and get him off the street. But because none of his complaints stick, I think it's going to be rather difficult. And that whole interaction that she has with him in the bar, and then how he interacts with those around him after Steele leaves, I mean, it just shows how much of a trash person he actually is. He's arrogant, misogynistic, and rude, and all of those are traits that we watch play out in his interactions with the public. And with them, he's also intimidating and violent. So how are you liking the series so far? Which of the performances are your favorite? I mean, even if they're dirtbag characters, the actors are doing a wonderful job at crafting these people, so I can see how you could have a favorite performance even if you hate the character. But let me know who it is in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.